Good afternoon, everyone. We're in the committee of the whole meeting of Tuesday, April 25th. And we did actually start this meeting at 11, but we are now on agenda item 4.1, which is community amending contributions policy discussion. Just to maybe frame this, we did adopt an interim community policy, what, a year and a half ago now? 2 years ago?
Year and a half.
June 2015.
Wow, almost 2 years ago. And I think we've sort of been testing it out and trying to validate it, and this is a conversation to sort of readdress that and to sort of bring forward perhaps a final version that we can move forward on. So without further ado, Gary, are you kicking this off? Or
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council. Actually it was December 2015.
Okay, so a year and a half ago.
Yeah. So again, we're not intending to make a decision today. This is really to sort of get a handle on whether or not staff and council are aligned in terms of this being potentially the way to move forward. If we choose that this is, then we can certainly go back and draft something a little bit more robust and then bring it back to the council before going out to the community for discussion. So this is just the start. So as you can see, back in 2015, we adopted the interim policy with those interim allocations. So depending on the type of rezoning, the allocation of the targets are 10,000 per single detached lot, $6 per square foot of multifamily residential. And the funds that are generated are going to affordable housing, general amenities, in various ratios between 60 and 75%, some to childcare as well. General amenities being a range of neighbourhood amenities, priority to fire halls, park improvements, recreation facilities as appropriate. So a fairly general list of what potentially could be covered. So what we're trying to do is take a more strategic look at this and look at focusing and prioritisation, some issues around facility redevelopment, and look at some issues that came out of recommendations from the Housing Task Force. So those sort of three things are top of mind in the discussion we're trying to prompt here. So when the consultant went through there's a fairly extensive list of amenities attached to the interim report, fairly exhaustive in fact. What it did really miss though is what are the options or alternatives or potential funding sources for those amenities. What options do we have to fund them? The other was there was no real prioritisation. Having said that, there was a little bit in the allocation tables, but so we're looking for sort of can we prioritise and make a more strategic allocation of CAC funds. Similarly, the recommendations of the Housing Task Force have come forward in recent months, talking about potential amendments that are possible to the policy. So we provided the table of future amenity categories in a more general sense, and provided some funding options for those different categories. So your basic infrastructure is fundable through debentures, development cost charges, revenues, reserves. There's a fair range of those. Borrowing is best practice. Diking infrastructure, we have borrowing or EMBC grants, and again borrowing. Recreational facility programs, again, CACs may be possible here, borrowing and grants. Again, long-term emergency response program facilities, so your fire halls, stuff like that, debentures and grants, community amenity contributions are possible. Borrowing, again, is typically what the method that we use to get there. Municipal hall redevelopments, debentures and grants, amenity contributions. Borrowing is typical, but there's a little bit of a wrinkle with that, is that they have been known to fail public assent tests, and in our research for the run-up to the civic centre planning, that was sort of evident in a number of the other communities that we spoke to. So there is a bit of a funding test and a difficulty with municipal hall redevelopments. Affordable housings, the funding options have varied. None of them are particularly stable. Non-profit support, grants, amenity contributions, density bonusing, DCC waiving. What we're talking about there is typically a provincial or in many years past a federal function that's been downloaded, and it hasn't been downloaded with any stable funding source. There are lots of options, but none of them are particularly stable. They're all, in many cases, dependent on development coming forward or working with a non-profit. So there isn't a stable or firm source of funding for the affordable housing portfolio. Active transportation is a subset of basic infrastructure. We've isolated it because of council's sort of strategic emphasis on that. Again, borrowing and grants. Typically, we've funded that from reserves that are not sustainable in the long run, and I believe Ms Matthews has addressed that in past budget presentations, is that we can continue to do that for the foreseeable future, but we'll need a more robust funding source. DCCs are an option there as well, and I'll come back to that later on. Public transit, transit grants, debentures and user fees. We get provincial subsidies, so those are likely to continue. That's sort of a gap funding that we need to deal with, whether it's through debentures or others. Regional transportation would be grants and user fees again. Again, that's a new program that's out there that we're uncertain as to how that may or may not be funded. And then childcare facilities, grants, non-profits, private funds as a private business, CACs are a possibility. And as noted, we have a somewhat limited sphere of influence over that, unless we get into municipal operation of those facilities. So just looking back through the categories, 3 through 6 in the numerical list don't have typical or robust sources. Recreational and amenity facilities typically well accepted. There tends not to be issues with having long-term debentures approved by public assent. As noted, municipal office facilities, and we've come across a number of those in our research. Mr. Plum could probably name a few that get rejected either through referendum or some form of public assent that fails. And affordable housing, again, they're downloading and could create a potential significant risk if they're not funded properly. Facility replacement and redevelopment, probably best dealt with under the long-term real estate and facilities strategy that we've got under development right now. We do have a fairly dated facility portfolio. There are significant deficiencies and replacement needs. We have work right now on fire hall replacement on Tantalus. Brennan Park's in the offing as a redevelopment. And Muni Hall is again one of those projects that again is on the horizon. But if you look back at the current assignment on the table on the first page, there's a fairly wide-ranging distribution of potential CAC funds, whether it's affordable housing, general amenities that's framed quite widely, and childcare facilities. So given the funding options that we've got, we're sort of suggesting that we might want to try and focus some of those amenity contributions onto areas where there are less stable or more firm methods of funding. We did note that active transportation could be funded through DCC collections. That highlighted the need to make sure that we keep that bylaw updated, and the project scope for those road projects does include the active transportation linkages. So that's something that we will keep top of mind and make sure that bylaw is current. With respect to childcare, they're typically not facilities or programs that we have direct control over or operate. We made a lot of progress, in staff's opinion, that we've, through our regulatory efforts through the rezoning process, that we've facilitated new developments. Also, given the limited sphere of influence that we have in the community charter, staff's of the opinion that we might be better to focus some of those elsewhere on some of the programs that have less stable funding sources. Now, with respect to the housing task force, recommendations from late last year. What it recommended essentially was an increased allocation of the CAC funds and to develop an inclusionary housing program. So what that is suggesting is that the larger developments physically provide units, affordable units that are under the control of some form of housing agreement. That may require that we have some sort of program to manage that. That's part of the work that we've got ongoing with the housing coordinator. But that smaller rezoning projects continue to provide cash in lieu of units because it's difficult to get an allocation or a physical construction out of maybe 4 or 5 unit projects. So the smaller units we'd suggest continue to follow the current pattern that we have. I did list some of the province's guidelines that they have with respect to CACs, whether it's through negotiation, identifying amenities ahead of time, having a clear sort of a clear purpose behind the policy, keeping it modest. Applying the DCC principles again is having a clear list of amenities that you're collecting, that the policy is gathered around. Engaging the community, I say we're not at that point. We need to do that once we've got some direction from council. One of the common themes that comes out of those guidelines is that to try and link the amenities with the impact of the development being proposed. So I listed a few examples there. So if you've got a high-rise building and we need new fire equipment, for example, then perhaps the CAC should be targeted at least in part to that issue. A development's never going to buy us the new equipment, but it should be proportionately contributing to the issue created by it. So sort of a move away from direct contributions and consider direct and related impacts of the development and how we can address those. So what we're trying to sort of focus the conversation here on is can we get an increasing focus on fund allocations? Can we look at currently unfunded facility needs, address the housing task force recommendations? So we've suggested as a think piece, not as a policy direction, but as a thought piece, as a discussion starting point, applications smaller than 20 units and applications larger than 20 units are then split. So there's sort of a policy split between the larger and the smaller. The smaller ones continue to pay a cash contribution, and I've used the same amounts for the sake of simplicity, and a provision of active transportation and park amenities that are required in the immediate neighbourhood and are related to the particular development, and that any cash contributions go 50-50 to critical amenities and affordable housing. Critical amenities, we're looking at Brennan Park and Muni Hall. Of course, those are 2 projects that we have sort of on our horizon. And that sort of thinking sort of carries most of the way, all the way through the smaller rezoning applications. When we get to the larger 20 or more dwelling units, what we've suggested is that we move towards a minimum of 5% of the units dedicated as affordable housing under a housing agreement, so there is no cash contribution, and that they then proportionally respond to the park and active transportation needs in the community created by that. If they do provide cash in lieu, that's split between active transportation and critical amenities. And that sort of thinking, 5% again is there as a number. You could almost put X there, but moving away on the larger ones, away from a cash contribution to a physical provision of units. Developers have land, they have financing, and they have the expertise in construction. We don't have any of those, or we have very limited resources in land, finance, and we don't build. So that really probably is a summary of sort of the direction that we're suggesting. So we were hoping to sort of prompt a conversation from council, and if we need to move in a different direction, then we can do that. If this is something that council wants us to pursue, we can then bring back something a little bit more robust. We didn't want to get into doing a lot of work and be offside from council right off the bat. So.
Okay. So this, I know you've attempted through the report to try to focus the conversation, because this can go in 500 directions. So just looking for council to make sure we're being focused. I'm just wondering if council wants to have a bit of a conversation about the aspects that were brought up at the beginning of Gary's report, and some of the things that are currently outlined in our current one, and then talk about the recommendations that are down below. I just have a feeling if we just open it up, council will be on 5 different things at once, and I want to make sure we're moving the conversation forward. Susan, Ted.
Thanks. As far as I understand, there's an extremely prescriptive legal framework for community amenity contributions. I really like what you've recommended, Gary, and I've been an advocate for childcare policy because I think that policy affects the amount of space more than having dribblings of cash going into a nondescript account. I've never understood why we pick childcare, except it's a fancy thing to say that we have.
I think we had that conversation, and I was actually still surprised that we kept keeping it in.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just do a quick poll. Council's satisfied to take out childcare within our community amenity contribution designation. We're dealing with it, so we're of different minds there. Okay, keep going. I thought there was consensus, but there isn't.
We can't buy space, we can't run daycare, we can't contribute to other people's space because it's not a community amenity contributions. What we have done for policy is allowed daycares everywhere. The only thing that prohibits daycares from running is having staff, and that's not something that we can control as a municipality. Facilities are not a problem. You can have a daycare in every house in Squamish. So it's not facilities that we need. Every mother can take in kids. If you want to go over a certain amount, you have to go through regulations that are not controlled by the municipality. So having cash dribblings for a nondescript account where it could be going to affect community amenities, which are very prescriptive in affecting the neighborhood, is affecting density, affecting the quality of living in the neighborhood. So I'd rather see us saving for an art space or something that we can actually manage or run. We have no savings for an art space or facilities. Maybe that's something that goes into Brennan Park, and we can just add to Brennan Park, let's say that portion is to contribute to an art space or something.
So maybe if I can I'll go back to you in a second. I just, on the childcare facility piece of it, I'm trying to just check things off the list here. Someone with a dissenting opinion to that one. Councillor Elliott?
So I think that we do have a role to play in childcare, and I know that most of that funding comes from senior levels of government, but if we put money towards critical amenities, I don't think we should build Muni Hall or Brennan Park without a childcare facility in it. We don't need to run it. We can, lease that space out. But I think we need to be thinking about providing more. We don't have enough here. Our EDI stats show that our preschoolers are not prepared as well as they could be for kindergarten. The other thing that New West is doing is they have a childcare grant program, and running a childcare program to be profitable is difficult because it's already so expensive. And so what New West is doing is that they do collect money. They have a childcare grant program which facilities can apply to renovate, to buy needed equipment, to upgrade over time. And so that is to make sure that we've got awesome space for children to be in, not just people making do. And so that's one way to go about it. So I don't think it should disappear completely from our CAC policy, but I think it should be targeted, or else we deal with it through actually a thorough childcare strategy like New West has done to encourage built space, to make it easier for people to apply. But New West is creating new spaces, and they are providing some funding for it. So I think, there is a need in our community. Like, there's not enough childcare spaces.
Absolutely, there's a need in the community. The need for a lot of things. I think we just have to figure out what our role is in that meeting. And I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily.
Yeah, thank you. On this point, I agreed with the flow of the report and dropping childcare from it. And there's no debate about the need. That's not the issue. But I think, as Councillor Chappelle points out, you can put them now as a result of changes we've made practically everywhere. They are, I think, almost without limitation. There's probably exceptions to this, but most of them are private businesses, and so there's a limit to what we can contribute to them and support in any event. And so you wonder then, where would the funds go? And I agree with Councillor Elliott. I think, if we're building a city hall or if we're redoing Brennan Park, those are two that jump out at me. We could put facilities in there, but clearly they could be part of those budgets. I think it's just our will that would make it happen in those particular spaces. And I don't know that we need an amenity policy which gets funding sort of at irregular intervals frequently in this economy, but that would necessarily be put to something like that, in the case of City Hall and Brennan Park, might not sort of appear in the horizon for 5 years from now. So I think that money in the meantime could be dealt with separately, assuming the need is still there when projects like that come along, like Brennan Park and City Hall. It's our will to put it in the budget, and we allocate and create space for it. And I don't think we need a separate reserve to do that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody disagrees with those sentiments. It's just whether it should be a community amenity contribution. And the dribblings that we get from this contribution will never buy a space, will never build a space. I love the idea of grants. That's a great idea. That can be done through community granting. Like, there's so many other ways to facilitate that will actually be meaningful amounts of money. Community amenity contributions need to be amalgamated to deal with neighborhood issues. And since we can have childcare, we've removed all barriers for childcare through this council. We've relieved people of secondary, nobody has to pay any utilities if they're opening a daycare. They can have it, as it's not the space. We've had and have a space in Brennan Park, but we couldn't find anybody to operate it, and we can't operate with CAC funds. It's not sustainable. We need sustainable funding mechanisms and appropriate levels of policy to deal with childcare, and it really is about having enough employees and having enough, we have space isn't the issue. And community amenity contributions can't be building space. Like, you can't take those amenities and,
Yeah, you can.
but building a space in the building that you're already building, you can't run the facility afterwards. And even if we opened a daycare tomorrow, we still wouldn't be able to staff it. So that is the issue. It doesn't actually build childcare facilities. So we, the idea of grants to supply equipment for people that want to open a daycare in their homes, I love that idea. Community amenity contributions are not a sustainable way to do that, because you'll run out of amenity contributions. You need some sort of long-term, and that's within our purvey to set aside money in our budget to do that, to provide grants, and that makes it open for everybody and is sustainable.
Yeah, and so I'll just weigh in a little bit on this. I think if we're going to be using CACs to augment, build a new rec center, build a new municipal hall, we can always allocate within those projects childcare facilities, and in essence, childcare facility would be encompassed within those projects. So I don't think we need it specifically for that. I do like the idea of grants, but again, that's as Councillor Chappelle said, a sustainable yearly funding mechanism. So I think we want to set up another policy, another system within our taxation realm that would allow for that, and that's something I think we could discuss in the future. But CACs are unpredictable. They'll go up and down with the waves of development and not. And so I think for something like this, foundational piece could be accomplished within our recreational or other facilities we're building that we could use CACs towards. And the granting or encouragement piece can be done through other mechanisms. I don't think, I think the intention is good, but I don't think necessarily CACs is the right place for it.
So would we include so if someone's building a large development, would we include childcare space as a critical amenity? Because we do have a space problem, for sure. And, you know, the schools have just moved some of their programs out of the school to make room for classrooms. And that's left a lot of parents scrambling for where to put before school care and after school care. Like, we do and we will need space, so.
And let me ask a question for Gary and Jonas. If the development came forward and said, we're gonna put 5,000 square feet of purpose-built, zoned only childcare facility in the development, how would we equate that in a CAC contribution?
It wouldn't have to be a CAC. We would be looking to secure that as a purpose-built space that's going to generate some revenue as well for the developer. Just like we're moving with office space being on the second floor downtown as a requirement. You know, it may not be the highest use for the developer, but it'd still be a commercial operation.
So we could set up a requirement
Within our OCP,
within the expectations of other policies.
So I'm not married to it being the CAC, but I think we have a critical issue, and I think we need a broader strategy to address it. It's not going to go away in the short term. And we need to be mindful of where we need daycare spaces and the quality of daycare that our parents want. And so, you know, does that look like a platypus, or does it look like more home care? And we can't assume that people will be satisfied with just home care. They might want licensed, well-trained. And our EDI stats show that we should probably be trying to facilitate more of that to make sure that kids are ready. So, so you
I don't
know.
think anyone disagrees with that.
No, I know. It's just that if it doesn't belong here, where does it belong, and how do we move that forward? Because it's not going to go away. It's going to get worse.
And I know we are trying to address that in the OCP and with how specific we can get.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I agree with Karen. I also agree CACs is not the answer, but I do think we should look at having a good discussion about forming some kind of strategy for daycares, particularly when we see development going next to the schools. Because, I mean, if we, in a perfect world, we'd talk the schools into building a big place. Can't really do that. Right next to the school, if there's a development going in, then we might be able to influence the development and possibly even help purchase a space there.
So I'm hearing general consensus, it's an important issue, we need to address it through other policy means, but maybe the CAC policies, specifically where we allocate specific funds to it. Just general nodding, everyone okay with that? Can we move on from
Yep,
that
I
particular
can,
issue? Okay. Okay, 1 out of 20 knocked off there. That's that. Moving along. So moving on to the next issue.
The next issue of housing.
Sorry, of CACs, I stopped you off at just the childcare because I wanted council to sort of
Yeah.
get it out of the
Okay.
system.
The other other
Next.
thing is collecting units instead of cash.
So inclusionary zoning, and there's a recommendation in the report for 5%. It seems low to me, so
Yeah.
maybe that's where for the Daegu one, we insisted on just over 10%, or they provided 10%.
it wasn't
The city of
affordable
Vancouver is
housing.
more like 25% inclusionary zoning for purpose-built rental. And they have a more sophisticated program of how to density bonus and incentivize that. But I'm just wondering how staff came up with 5, is that just a starting point? How realistic would 10% be?
I can answer, the 5 was just picked randomly to generate conversation. It has nothing further than that.
So I don't like what we're doing with the community mandated contributions, because we always we may or may not do one project and that blows our entire budget. We still don't collect, we add density and we're adding quite a bit of density, but we're not collecting units. We need to collect units in all over Squamish, not hope for the one big project. And I know we've got some good projects in the future, or project, but once that's done, it's done. And then you're still left with affordability problems. It won't address the affordability. Unless we have a policy that collects units and manages units, we will get nowhere with affordable housing. We have to we're using up our land faster than we're able to collect units for affordable housing. And if we're giving density bonusing and rezoning single-family lots for 72 houses, we need to be able to say, look, 10% of your stock, or 5% of your stock is going to go into,
So inclusion,
Yeah,
did
rental.
everyone agree that we need some sort of inclusionary zoning?
yeah.
Staff recommends starting point for discussion at 5%. Currently, the last development that we did was just over 10%. And I think that's sort of the basis of where we've been sort of hinting at for a while, so Doug and then Karen.
Thanks. So I think there's two things here. One is purpose-built rental, which would presumably be a market, versus sub-market housing, which is in effect subsidized by the developer and presumably handed over to some agency within or associated with the district to manage as housing stock. The rental, the market rental, probably not. Maybe not, but that's, in my mind, that's a different category. And so when I looked at this, and when you look at, if you're looking at less than 20 units, then we're talking about cash to affordable housing. We'll build up a pot. It may all disappear with one development. It may be able to be sprinkled over a couple. We'll just see how the world unfolds. But when you're talking about the larger rezonings, where you're going to have some built on site, and I think we have to be clear whether it's all market purpose built because that's the niche we want to fill, or whether we also want to, say, split it between market rental and sub-market rental and manage some. And maybe it's 5 and 5%, 5%, 5%. And the advantage of that, if we did start putting sub-market rentals in these various developments, the advantage of that for me is that it gets away from the kind of the ghettoizing of it. You know, it scatters it around the community and integrates it into the community, and it loses some of the stigma that sometimes can attach to that. Clearly, a management structure is required for them to go down that road, and I think we're heading that way. But it's obviously a need. Then is how do you deal with these things? Because the times the municipalities tried in the past, I've seen in private practice, just didn't work. And they ended up with just a lump of cash because they had a policy with no way of actually making the policy kind of work on the ground. So that to me is a key consideration in that I don't, in my mind, have numbers. I think we've got to make sure we keep this within the realm of economic reality. If you start getting larger numbers that are coming away from just pure market development, where the money is actually really generated, then of course we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. But I think when we're focusing on this, remember that there are two types of rental housing, and maybe there's an advantage to us to have bits of both in these larger developments.
So my question was, what do we mean by affordable?
Non-market, so below market
So thinking
rental housing.
80% market or 75%.
Or 80% of the average income.
Right.
Going, making sure that only 30% of that is being spent on housing.
Okay. And my other question is, could we look at, for these larger developments where they're maybe building single-family detached lots, could we look at setting up a land trust, so those properties go into a land trust so that we actually get the land underneath it and then have equity in those homes. And so when people sell them, they're limited to a certain gain on the price of the home, but the equity stays in the land, so the house remains affordable over time. So we could limit it, sort of rent and manage it, or we could start to set up this land trust around the community where we actually have homes. It's just another way to perhaps be able to borrow against the equity for people that are in that situation.
And there's variations of that around in Whistler and mixed income housing draft plan that we never adopted. Carrie, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, you can. The equity model's a little bit more sophisticated, and it's going to take us a little bit more time to get to be able to run that. this was sort of focused more on the rental side. And I do take Councillor Race's comments. We've missed something on the purpose-built rentals, so we'll come back with something on that one. Yes, we can, but I think we're a few years away from being able to run an equity program. But yes, we can. I've seen it done.
I think there's, with regard to the purpose-built rental versus providing some affordable housing, there are different conversations. I think the rental piece, I think we need to figure out how do we create inclusionary zoning so we're getting all housing types within developments. Not just cookie cutter townhomes, cookie cutter single family homes, cookie cutter mid-rise apartments. We get everything in between. So we need to figure out a way to create the zoning, the inclusionary zone that includes all those things, including, not of inclusion, purpose-built rental as a portion of that. So I think that's different from creating affordable housing, which has a formula. So that's almost like there should be an expectation of X amount. Now, there may be density bonusing. Maybe there's a minimum. You do 5% purpose-built rental on anything over 200 units or whatever you determine that line is. You can build more if you provide 10%. Like we create some sort of density bonusing issue to encourage or incentivize more of that. I'm just throwing numbers out. I don't know where that sort of tipping point would be. And obviously developers need to be considered in this or consulted in this because they have ultimately bottom lines as well. So, but I think that's separate. I think affordable housing is providing non-market housing. Inclusionary zoning is a whole other policy piece to help actually get the housing stuff that we need to get.
Absolutely, I think it's kind of like the childcare facilities. It's a requirement that developers have to hit, but it's not a CAC. And to date, we haven't treated purpose-built rentals as CACs. They've just been a requirement of the development when it comes to
Except we
rezoning.
haven't required it yet.
We have with Dayview.
That was the other one.
That was the only one. And then the MUD 1 bylaw, it also includes the density bonusing for 30% to be purpose-built rental. So doing something like that.
Exactly.
But I agree that it's probably not in the CAC policy. The CAC policy should look at strictly at affordable, non-market rental units.
Ted,
Yeah, it's just, I mean, if we're aiming at a housing authority, we've got to have houses in it. And with the purpose-built rentals, who would be managing them? The owner of the condos, or would that go into the?
purpose-built rental like the Dayview would be covenanted in perpetuity, life of the building, or 70 years, whichever is the longest.
That's right.
Because if you're,
And we wouldn't manage them.
if you're
that's not-
forming a housing authority, you want to get as many units in there as you can.
And that's where the subsidized units would be managed, not necessarily just purpose-built rental.
So I'm just talking about the percentage, you know, I mean, 5% purpose-built, 5%, you might not want to go that high with the purpose-built.
Disagree? Susan?
Thanks. I'm a huge advocate for, land trust or housing authority, they're both the same thing. They're both ways of managing your units, and I think we're a few years behind. We have so much density in town now that has no units in it for affordable housing, and now we're scrambling to catch up. I would like to bring up employee housing because that's a whole separate, as we focus on a lot of tourism and built infrastructure in town, I know that a ton of business owners are now losing their employees because of affordability in town.
I feel
So I
like we need to
wonder-
focus this conversation because we're talking about CAC specifically.
Right, but
and
where in that conversation of CACs, and we've
Doesn't-
talked about high-end, like market housing and non-market housing, and is
So
input,
that's the
my
question,
question
employment
is,
housing, does it fit into CACs?
No, but actually it's another interesting one that we could place on the commercial side. So
yeah,
leave that, that's an interesting idea. So I'll take that and see what we can do with that in the policy.
yeah, somewhere.
I think it should go with the affordable housing piece, because with the affordable housing, if the district ensuring that there's a certain amount of units, we want to make sure that it's secured for people that live and work or have retired in Squamish. I think with the provincial program, it's much more open to the whole province.
And the employment housing thing is an interesting thing. I think the smart employees out there who are worried about like the gondola are going and being proactive about ensuring they can get some employee housing because they need people to work for them.
Those are big employers, the smaller
The
employers.
smaller employers, absolutely, and they're gonna have a hard time. So how do you,
Hard time.
I mean, Whistler has some policies around, you can only get into this program if you are 100% working in Whistler. Is it both people in the couple? Is it, you know, I know they're having issues with how do you determine if someone starts off, gets a house or gets into a place, is working in Whistler, and now all of a sudden their construction job is moved down to Squamish, now they're commuting. So there's challenges to that. But I think particularly we do need to figure out with large employers, because everything trickles down to the small employers. If something like Great Wolf Lodge ever returns, or something of that magnitude where you're looking at 400 or 500 employees, there has to be within the development application consideration of employee housing, particularly if there's a particular target of employee that, you know, young person, single person employee, just like Whistler Blackcomb has specific employee housing. So I think that's where we can really target. If you target the bigger businesses, they're not taking up all the housing that would otherwise be taken up, and they're freeing some up ideally for the smaller ones. But I don't know how we would deal with that on a small, like, I'm not sure we want to be checking everyone's T4 at the end of the year to make sure they've gotten every penny of their income from a local business.
Yeah, having been involved in maybe the first one in Whistler, now the expert just walked in the room, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But
I wasn't going to mention it at all, but
Just talking to businesses around.
But really, you know, for the purposes of the CAC discussion, we're talking about a category of sub-market housing, whether it's single family or multifamily. I don't think it really matters. There's issues around both of them. But really what you're talking about doing is qualifying the purchaser, and that's the process. And that qualification could be for one area, it could be one thing, and for another area, it could be another thing. And so one of the qualifications, for example, might be income for some units. Another qualification might be residency or job in Squamish or something of that nature. And both of those examples have been tried in different places. To Councillor Elliott's point, there is a way to deal with somebody actually purchasing a unit and it doesn't have to be single family. It could be a multi-family strata unit. And having the hope of getting some equity return, and really then what you're doing is you're just controlling that return. And so there's no 40% increase like we just went through in Squamish, but there might be a 10% increase if they sold within 1 or 2 years. And over time, of course, those units will separate from the market. Occasionally, the market's gone the other way, which creates a little bit of chaos in the system, but usually the market is above those. It is possible. It's a bigger discussion to put that deal together. And so in the terms of CACs, for me, it's a housing discussion. CACs, I think, our general goal, I hope, is just to say, okay, how much would come from a development? So a developer would have some idea going in what they're going to have to provide. And what we do with it, we've still got some work to do on it to fine tune that, I think. And that's our housing coordinator, et cetera.
so just trying to focus in on the CAC piece of it.
I really think that it has to be broader than housing too, and I like the list that staff has provided. As far as, you know, you never really know until a development is built what the impact of the density is going to be to the neighborhood. And sometimes you have to collect the money up front and not have it assigned anywhere, and then notice what problems are being caused in the neighborhood because of the extra density, and that's where the CAC contributions should go towards. And a lot of communities have, you know, community art, and that's what the one thing that I saw missing from it is having an art collection, is that, you know, adding public art to areas is often paid for by community amenities. But arts, to our community, I think art space is almost more relevant, and we don't really have anything to do with art space. We still don't, if you wanted to have a lecture in Squamish with more than 150 people, you would not be able to have a space, so I'm not sure.
So I think it's
Recreation.
recreation program facilities in my mind was
Arts as well,
all sorts of
if we could just make sure that
Yeah.
it's the languages.
recreational and arts program facilities, just to make it clear, but that was certainly, my perception was that something like that is included in what our goal is. So, just quickly too, I'm looking at the starting point for discussion table, and I think Councillor Chappelle talked about public art. And in my mind, there's a differentiation between what makes a good development, what makes a good built environment, what's expected. From my mind, public art is part of any development. It's not an add-on, it's fundamental. Active transportation, in my mind, a bike lane or a connector trail is as fundamental as a road. It's not an add-on, a nice to have. It's not a community amenity, it is an infrastructure piece. And it's an expectation beyond just community amenity, from my point of view. We have to take a philosophically different approach to what we see as an amenity or what we see as infrastructure. And for me, active transportation is infrastructure. If you're contemplating a road, and that's part of the development, you're contemplating a trail, you're contemplating a bike lane, you're contemplating a sidewalk. It's not nice to have. So, and that's where I think I have a little bit of a problem with this, considering active transportation as a CAC. If it's above and beyond, if it's a trail park or something like that, if it's above and beyond, maybe. But active transportation itself is not a CAC, it's a fundamental part of the project.
I think the intent was to have these off-site improvements. So if the neighborhood needs, additional improvements to the park space that's already
Okay,
there.
so it's not necessarily on the new development, it is to augment active transportation in other places, okay.
And maybe,
Makes more sense.
when it comes to park space, if the developer wanted to open up its development and put their park space, their open space as publicly accessible park space, that could be also considered as an amenity because it adds to the community itself. It allows the community into the development.
But are you talking above and beyond the 5% allocation?
Yes, so we don't always get the 5%. Like if it's a property and someone's coming in and they're just putting in townhouses, we wouldn't get the 5%. But we would require a certain amount of open space to be allocated inside that development. So there's a potential here with our community amenity contribution policy to make that open space. If somebody opened it up to the public and let's say brought it forward to the street and made it part of a open space that's also a publicly accessible park, that could be treated as a CEC.
This is on the critical amenities, so we're off the fast housing and so forth.
I think so, I think, actually, I don't know if we're off housing, we got distracted.
You distracted.
No, I was, somebody else.
Well, my,
Go ahead.
okay, so it was on the definition of critical amenities, or the other half of the thing. And so there's two sides to this, of course. There's the developer going in and the certainty, and the second side is what we do with it, or the guidance to a council, how we deal with it. So the first one I think is relatively simple, and I agree with the 50%. And it will be cash, and we have a formula for that, and so there's certainty for the developer going in. The question of what kind of guidance, and this is a policy, not a bylaw, I think, anyway, it's guidance for council. And maybe it's too restrictive, just saying Brendan Park or City Hall, for example. And so I think that definition, from my perspective, we'd want to widen the definition a little bit. It would give council flexibility to pick other projects and other types of projects, because we don't really know exactly what's going to come at us in the future. And what might be critical today might not be as critical in 2 years because we found another source of funding today, or we just plain had a change of heart. So I think for council, I think that we want a bit of a wider definition, or wider guidance about what we might do it. And there would be some municipal benefit, obviously, but I think that could be pretty wide. And so, for example, we've had people come to me and said, what about using the amenity policy for things like, you know, the Sea to Skies Community Services Building or Centerpoint. Another one going on right now is the hospice fundraising, and I don't want to debate the pros and cons of those. But just that idea, if there was something in the future the council thought was worthy of getting some funds, could we apply those funds to them, assuming it met all the other parameters? So in my mind, I'm looking for a broad enough policy that maybe in default it goes to something like City Hall or Brennan Park, unless there's something else that is really pressing for council that they would want to support at that time.
Ruminating on what you're saying. I think there's a bit of a danger in opening the door up massively to things that maybe aren't municipal responsibilities. I think there's a bit of a danger there. There's other appropriate funding for that type of thing, but I do agree that we don't necessarily want to be overly specific that things do come up.
On that note, Mr. Plum, right before the meeting, said that there's been some interesting information come out of the sort of preliminary work on the long-term real estate facility strategy. So I would agree. We'll look at that definition, provide it a greater sort of breadth and some flexibility, but I appreciate where the mayor's going to with there's a certain limit at some point.
And I wasn't intended to be all of a sudden raise the profile of the grant and aid program or anything like that. It would be, I think, a fairly high threshold and quite restrictive, from my mind, what might qualify. And ultimately, it's a council decision anyway. But rather than just necessarily focus it on two major projects or two major initiatives that we see coming up in the next few years, leave it at that.
Okay. So just focusing again on the starting point for the discussion. Do you want to walk us through some of those, Gary, or would you want us to just comment
On the
starting discussion points? You have a whole table.
Well, to be honest, it's really sort of the first part of the table, the smaller applications. Nothing fundamentally has changed there other than the fact that we're the allocation of the costs has changed to just affordable housing, critical amenities, or active transportation. So not a great deal has changed there. I didn't change the amounts of the CAC target amounts. Again, we can revisit that.
And they're just targets. If a development comes forward and it makes sense to use 90% of the CACs to do something, we can do that, and 5% to affordable housing. Within that 100%, we can fluctuate as long as we're focusing in on what we've outlined within the CAC policy in terms of where those funds might go.
So yeah, I think we may be onto something there. Is that rather than having, maybe we just need to delete that column and have something instead about how the funds can be used once collected, rather than saying half for this, a quarter for that, a quarter for that. Is they're going into a reserve fund, a CAC reserve fund, and the uses for the CAC reserve fund are A, B, C, and D. That might be a better way than...
Well, I like the idea of making sure that it's clear what some of the objectives are, particularly if affordable housing is topical. So within it, but I think we need, as I think someone outlined, these are basically guidelines to help council make decisions. So I think it's okay to say at this point in, we have a focus on affordable housing, and it's okay to have that guideline there for staff to begin the negotiation. I think that's okay, but ultimately, it's up to council to have the discretion, should there be a development that comes forward that's, you know, hey, we've got this going in and we can leverage this and put this in now. I think we did something similar on the Scirocco project, for example. It didn't quite work out to 50 or 60% affordable housing on that one. But we have that discretion, but I think it's good for council to be able to layer in priorities within the CAC policy. Does that make sense? Yep. Does that make sense to council? Depending on, yeah, people are welcome to join in the conversation, come up and just have a seat.
If I may, it's a very interesting conversation. I mean, it's fascinating, really. I think if I put my developer's hat on, what the development community wants is certainty. So the idea of just giving you a number, X, be it usually a very large number, and having you put it in a fund and decide what you do with it, that's quite appealing, because then we don't have to get into an argument about what this costs or what that costs. You say it costs one thing, we say it costs, and all of that goes away. But what I would say about affordable housing, and I do know a lot about it, that before you rush into an affordable housing authority, there are some downsides. Wages in Whistler are substantially lower than Squamish because people can afford to live on less. And although we have 75% in Whistler of the employees living in employee housing, we haven't seen yet what the outcome of that will be when all those people just start to retire. There are lots of folks who live in single-family homes in Whistler whose home is worth $350,000 or $400,000. That's what the cap is. And so when they go to retire, our society is built around people investing in their own property. The Canadian Charter on Freedoms of Rights is really based around ownership in land. And so a housing authority changes that ownership, truly. And so I understand the pressure on you as a council, I think us as a community, to find a solution for housing. But if you take away people's ability to profit from owning that housing, paying their mortgage and working, I'm not sure that in the long run you'll get to where you want to get to as a society. I just put that out there as a possibility. So I like the idea. It's also good to build some kind of housing, because there's lots of federal money and provincial money and stuff that you do want to take advantage of, and whether that's rental, whether that's social housing, or some combination of all those things. I'm not saying that none of that exists, but you know, I think having a long-term view of what it is you create. And there was a very interesting report out of UBC about 10 years ago where they looked at affordable housing, and they looked at all the whole spectrum of what to do. And the solution they came up with was forcing people to build smaller units. That's how they dealt with the affordability. Instead of building 1,000 square foot units, they said, no, everybody has to build 500 square foot units. And you know, a 2x4 is a 2x4. You just halved the value of the units, and it made it more affordable. So there are other solutions. Not always, but...
Yeah, and the affordable housing conversation, we did get a little distracted, but we are trying to specifically focus on CACs. And I don't think there's any suggestion we're going to change the formula. $10,000 for single detached, $6,000 for square foot. There's no suggestion of changing that piece, which is the certainty piece for the developer.
Yeah.
I think the internal discussion is we prioritize, at this point, we've been doing 60% affordable housing. There's some discussion about what do we use that money for? Well, I think one of the basic things is we use that money for potentially buying a piece of land, then BC Housing and CMHC can fund something, or a nonprofit developer or something. So that's one piece. I don't know, maybe it goes to, if we're waiving DCCs for subsidized housing, maybe we have some money to be able to put in some of those infrastructure pieces that we wouldn't necessarily get if we were doing a subsidized housing project. So I think that's where the wiggle room of having that pot of money is useful to us, and that's what we've currently been doing, is putting money into a fund so we have some ability to, we're not going to build a building. There's BC Housing and CMHC and other funding mechanisms to actually build a building, but sometimes what they expect from us is we come with some land, and and that's certainly what we're trying to do now. So we're trying to focus in on the CAC policy, and we did have a bit of a formula, 5% of this and 70%. And I think what staff is trying to do through the discussion here is essentially break it down a little more simply, saying 50% affordable housing, 50% critical amenities, and then have some latitude within the critical amenities to focus in on specifics that might be generated because there's a specific need at a different time. We have a different focus, you know, we have an opportunity to leverage money to augment another piece. So I think that's the crux of the conversation. Now, am I getting that right or wrong, Jonas or Gary?
Yeah, I mean, this is useful, this has been very useful for us. So.
I think there's a whole inclusionary zoning piece, there's a whole strategy that there's some recommendations outlined in the Housing Task Force recommendations, some other policies that we have, that's a whole other piece, and that whole Housing Authority piece comes into something completely different than the CAC policy.
So I appreciate what you said, and I'll stick just to CACs. I think from a developer standpoint, I would say we would love to see the CAC spent as quickly as possible on amenities that directly affect the community as much as possible.
I've never heard you say that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, like, you know, parks,
That's new.
buildings, the last thing we want is to see that go stale.
Yeah.
So within your matrix there, I would have some flexibility, because maybe one year you're not doing any housing, but you're doing a park, and the next year you're not doing any parks, you're doing a house.
Yeah, and we do need to have the ability to bank it so that we can actually achieve something significant if we have that strategic goal. So you can't expect us to spend every penny in a year, we have to be able to bank it. Is it CAC related? I don't want to get into real estate strategy.
Absolutely. Well, it is in the sense that
Okay, I'm going to Susan.
Nice
Nice try.
Oh, sorry,
Go
yeah.
ahead, Susan.
So as far as CACs dealing with the entire, you know, to put a pile of money into CACs for specific, like a BC housing project, for instance, that's where I see that you get a large amount of money going to a one-off project that doesn't actually, that, you know, could be in neighborhood, like, that ends up being like, oh, Lori, we've got a project, but it really doesn't long-term address those community needs and end up being a long-term solution. We can't collect housing as a community amenity. We can't assign, like, is that more in the include? I think I'm unclear about that. Is that, can we say as a community amenity contribution, you donate X number of units for that? Can that be a community amenity contribution?
That can be considered as part of the equation, yeah.
So I would rather see units come in, because currently we
But
already
that's
have.
more inclusionary zoning, is it not?
Well, if we're
Yes.
talking affordable housing units,
Yeah.
below market,
Affordable,
well,
below
that's what's
market.
being proposed, is 5% being affordable below market rental units, not
Right.
cash in lieu, but units.
Units, okay. Yeah, as long as there's that, because, you know, to say there's, you know, I could argue all day about Whistler isn't the perfect housing authority to compare ourselves to because of wages and other completely different land use. There's a million different problems with that, but there's also a lot of really good things like completely flush, but, and able to pay for their entire transit community and projects on the side from that contribution. But having units, and we already have a housing authority, it's just not us right now. We're taxing our community services currently with managing units. We have a ton of units, but it's just, you know, people that should be focusing on childcare and mental health and other resources are having to manage units, and they're not the best people for the job. Not to say they're not doing a good job, but they could be focusing their attention on community needs differently, and a different structure should be set up as we grow. It was great while we had a few little units. Now we're starting to, you know, like with all our units and collecting units, it'd be great to actually have an appropriate
We're
infrastructure.
getting off topic. I was gonna go to Neil, but he's not there.
Scared him off.
Totally. Bill, did you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bill McNenny. My current hat is the capital campaign chairman for the Sea to Sky Community Process. So in the original policy, that was a draft policy of January 2016, there was a section in there that allowed community facilities to be addressed with the CAC funding. I,
And the community facilities are generally speaking municipal facilities.
right. What, and Councillor Race perhaps touched on it, what my question was to Linda was, do you think a facility that is independent of healthcare, that is supported by the community, would qualify because now they're getting 4 beds to further the service delivery model that you're already supporting? And if that policy would be there to allow support funding for that capital project, what would it have to look like? In other words, there's a misconception that because Vancouver Coastal Health have the footprint in Hilltop House, where this facility for these 4 hospice beds are being constructed, that they own that land and they run that supply. The provincial government has agreed to staff that for the nursing requirements, for the care delivery that's different from home hospitals. So, but the volunteers and the organization are the same one. You guys give 10,000 grant in lieu to the hospice group right now. Vancouver Coastal will give $5,000. The rest of the $60-odd thousand that they need to run their operation, they raise through fundraising locally in the community, the Height for Hospice. So to me, it's not like, and I can understand a reluctance to get involved in throwing money into Vancouver Coastal Health because for an obvious number of reasons. But I'm trying to say, I don't think it's that style of a description. I think the description is Vancouver Coastal Health, if we, the community, raise $2 million to allow them to build the structure under their rules and that, they will operate it, but the community hospice, Sea to Sky, and it's now not just Squamish, it's from on the Sea to Sky corridor. So my hope is that you guys, being the guinea pigs, would agree to say, we think that is a community amenity as opposed to just the healthcare delivery. And then I'll run that message up to Whistler and Pemberton and do the same dog and pony show for them to try and say, this is a community servicing that our community really needs. And it's a capital program that is maybe, well, hopefully not in my lifetime, going to come back again for increasing. So my question to you when this discussion was going on under community contributions is, do you feel that that kind of a facility would fall within your mandate?
My gut feeling is that no, it wouldn't. Not that it's not a valuable asset, and as you know, the Sea to Sky Hospital Board did give up the
Yes.
project. I think that's the appropriate capital funding governance board that can put money into that. And this is just my perception in terms of community amenity. For me, it's municipal, predominantly municipal infrastructure. Like we've got a list of $30 million worth of projects we'd like to probably build over the next 15 years. Ice Ring, another art center, as Councillor Chappelle's talked about. Things that are traditionally funded and governed under the Constitution as municipal function. We give a lot of money to social services, mostly because the provincial government isn't doing their job in funding social services and health services. So we make up the difference because we want to make sure we have a healthy community. Food bank, helping hands, hospice, women's center, Sea to Sky Community Services, the list goes on. In theory, we should have to be funding those things because the provincial government is funding those social service programs, those health service programs appropriately. They're not. So we do help out with that. I think the challenge is as soon as you start sort of adding on layers, and I'm thinking out loud a little bit here, because I really love the project and I really hope it, but you all of a sudden open a bit of a door to what next and what else that should be a provincial function. So there is a possibility that, you know, when we open into something like hospice, all of a sudden, you know, and I think where we do help, like we did with Centerpoint, is waiving DCCs. We have other mechanisms whereby we can help capital projects. Whether it becomes a CAC priority, I think it's a bit of a Pandora's box if we start to just move that line too much outside of, and that's up for council to discuss. And a council today will make a different determination depending on community need. If you were to ask for initial responses, it doesn't quite hit the criteria that I think the intention of what the past draft policy was trying to target. Doesn't mean it can't in the future. Sorry, Ted was next. That's you.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks, Bill, for all your hard work. I don't know when you're going to ever stop, but thanks.
Hopefully never.
Oh, this is for my future.
Yeah. You know, to Michael's point about the affordable housing, and I think he had a really valid point, is the size. So if we're going to start taking units in developments, hopefully we have some kind of mechanism to get small units, you know? Instead of status quo, where guys can put in 12 condos, we'll take one.
I did want to address the hospice
Okay,
question, that's why.
Well, on the hospice one, I think maybe on the hospice one, maybe we could look at the property. Maybe the district could own the property. We could buy the property that the building sits on.
We tried that with a proponent. The property is the,
Bill, you have to come to the table, sorry.
excuse me, Mayor Council. The situation for the 4-bed hospice is when they built the new Hilltop house, Hilltop South as it was called, the area immediately off the elevator, the service corridor for food, laundry, drug stuff and everything from the hospital into the Hilltop house was no longer needed. It was scheduled for renovation. So that became the potential target for a community hospice. Now, the original plan was that with a little bit of paint and stuff, they could open it as a hospice. Unfortunately, Vancouver Coastal don't see things that way. And their original budget was 2.8 million. We've got that down to 2 million as a target budget to renovate and provide 4 beds, 1 sacred space, and 1 community gathering place in that footprint that is the existing Hilltop site. So we thought we could wrestle away from Vancouver Coastal and do it ourselves. That isn't going to work. Their ball, their bat, their game.
If it was a
You
different
dealt
model, it
with
might work, but not with the.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the situation of it. The $2 million budget is cut down from the original version of what the Vancouver Coastal thought was needed. Originally, they wanted a 2-bed hospice, but the government won't fund anything under a 4-bed. So the good news of this whole thing is funding for hospice patients in a new facility will be provided for by the provincial government. And so our need is to come up with the $2 million budget. So yeah,
Thanks. You know, I do see hospice as something that happens with a growing population, that as the population grows, you can say it's healthcare, but death is not healthcare. Death is dignity, and dying with dignity is a very important community issue, and we are in desperate need of a hospice. And for me, it's not dignity for the population to have to go south and leave their families. And it's not something that, you know, the healthcare budget is insane right now, and the fact that our community's been left with a bill for this, and instead of leaving it to volunteers, I would like to make it a community amenity. I think it is a community amenity, and death with dignity and being able to supply those services is often not healthcare. It's support, and it's community caring for community, and it's often done by volunteers. So it's not, the medical part is often already provided for, and they'd be getting that medical care anyways. But what is not supplied for is a space where volunteers can actually come and a person can stay within their community to die with dignity. And I really, thinking about it more and more, I think it's a great project for community amenity contributions. And also looking at the way Vancouver funds community amenities is they look at the lift and property rezonings. They take like 70 to 80% of the lift in community amenity contributions. And that would feed our coffers a lot faster than
The provincial guidelines specifically say you're not supposed to use lifts, so.
right.
They have a different charter, maybe they're.
Maybe it's a different charter, but it's really interesting.
And just to clarify, the question was, the original outline
Yeah,
said community amenities. My interpretation is the intent was not hospice in that's what I'm saying. is
Yeah,
that's my
That's
interpretation.
Linda's designation to me.
And I guess the question is, where do we start to draw that line? You know, years ago, we took a community amenity to purchase the Women's Center building as a community amenity.
yeah.
It was generally, well, Center Point wasn't CSC, it was CCC rating. So I think it's just a matter of where we draw the line, and if we draw the line somewhere, how much more demand are we gonna start seeing in terms of the very limited fund that we have? And that's the question.
Can I
It's
just
not the
comment?
value of hospice.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah. And then-
But you look at our list, and we're always going to be deciding on what a community amenity contribution is. There will be no end to deciding what is beneficial to our community by councils, by the community, and it's always going to be different projects, and they'll always have to weigh those things. And right now, the need in town for hospice is immense.
Yeah, and then I don't think the intent is to get to specifics. I think that's where Councilor Race was going in terms of just
Yeah.
wanting to make sure we're broadening the definition from what's currently sort of theoretically outlined in the current policy to say, allow council of the day to make a bit more of an interpretation of what qualifies as a community amenity or not in terms of the general
Yeah,
Right.
amenity trend. I'm just going to go to Councilor
Okay.
Elliott.
So I can't sort of make up my mind, but I think about this in the same way that, you know, the province says that CAC should only be used for capital costs. And you can argue that having things like a women's center and a hospice and good childcare facilities are community amenities. And when these community groups start to work to fundraise, they work really hard to find the sponsors and the people who are going to contribute the capital. And I wonder if through our CAC policy, why, you know, we couldn't start to collect some of that capital for those amenities that truly provide a community benefit. You know, so like being able to do some capital improvements in a daycare, like being able to provide some capital input to the hospice, or, you know, a new women's center, that sort of thing. And, you know, so it would have to be timely because, as Michael said, you want to see those funds used. I don't think those kinds of projects are going to always be there, but they do come along, and so it's an interesting argument to think, you know, we should never play a role in operational funding, but they do provide a great community amenity, and if we can help facilitate and make that happen because we receive some community amenity contributions from larger developments, we could actually put a fair chunk into some of these capital projects to make them happen sooner or faster.
Recently, I think with Helping Hands, or there was some, I don't think the project actually worked, but absolutely, that's been part of it, but it hasn't been articulated clearly.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, I didn't want to lose childcare completely because I do think there's a facilitation role we can play through our CAC policy that facilitates some of these amenities to happen or improvements to happen. that doesn't become operational, so people don't become dependent on it. So as development fluctuates, so does our ability to contribute to these types of projects. But
We're way over time here on this conversation. Very briefly, Bill, because I want to get down to...
No, and just to say that the message that I hope I brought is that the capital program for hospice, while it's on Vancouver Coastal Health property and stuff, will be no change for the delivery of the hospice service. The people who will use the Hilltop House 4-bed community hospice from the Sea to Sky corridor will be those who need that medical attention at end of life. The 95% of the people dying with dignity in their homes will be serviced by the hospice volunteers that are going to be every year back for some kind of grant.
Yeah, it makes for an interesting debate, because certainly when we put community amenity contributions into an ice arena or a fire hall or something, we own that. Down the road, something happens, we can sell that, we can sell the land, we can lease the space, we can create revenue. Something like the Women's Center, we allowed for, I think it was a $200,000+ CAC contribution to be considered as part of that project. The Women's Center, in theory, could close up tomorrow and sell that land, and we have no ability to assure that those, in theory, they're, generated through municipal function to recoup that. And similarly here, so I think it's just a slightly different consideration.
I didn't say it was going to be easy.
No, I know, no. Helping Hands, in theory, if we build something, we might own the land underneath, so we'll have some ability to have a say. So I think there's a little bit of a consideration. It's not yes or no. But I think what I'm hearing from council is that we want to make sure we're opening up that general, what are we calling it? General amenity? Critical amenity definition to be inclusive and to be responsive to timely needs or issues that arise. In theory, hospice could almost be considered as part of your housing piece, not affordable housing, but it is.
Would 4 beds qualify for affordable housing?
Yeah, but anyway, so I think what I'm hearing from council is there's an openness to consider things like hospice. There's probably a list of 20 other entities that would theoretically qualify as a community amenity. Each would have to be evaluated on its own circumstances. But in theory, we've just added another $50 million worth of things that we want to fund through this thing that won't bring much money to us. But anyway, absolutely, that's what I'm generally hearing, is that there's an openness to broadening the definition of what a critical amenity could be within the CAC policy. Is that generally what I'm hearing?
Thank you for allowing me.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah. So that would be a change compared to sort of what is outlined in the previous version. General nods from council on that? And I think you end up having to deal with it on a one-off basis. And developers may have projects that they want to bring forward and say, hey, we want this to qualify and we're going to put X amount into this.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think just on the small units that Michael was talking about, to planning, so when you're bringing our report forward, I do think that's a really interesting concept so if a guy's putting in 200 units and you're saying, well, 5 of those are going to be ours and they're going to be affordable, perhaps go for 6 small ones. So just have a concept in there for small stuff, for rentals that we own. You know what I mean? Like Michael said, that UBC 10 years ago did a study on affordable housing, and what they came up with, built small houses.
Okay, so I think there's a whole, we're not going to achieve our affordable housing objectives within our CAC policy. This is just one piece of it, and I think what council and staff are saying is there's this whole other policy piece, inclusionary zoning, different strategies to get a whole range of that mixed middle housing stock that we're currently not getting through our current homogeneous zoning exclusive zones. Exclusive, only this, only that. So that's what that's a whole other policy piece that's going to be generated through the OCP and then ultimately through zoning amendments to the bylaws. That's a whole other thing. So on the CACs, I think generally, I haven't heard anything that's overly contradictory from what the table that staff has put in front of us, other than the broadleaf of critical amenities definition. I think it's cleaner to do 50-50 and within that 50%, and that affordable housing one is really evaluated on an individual basis. I mean, that's sort of the general guideline to start, a starting point guideline, but maybe more in a certain project, and maybe less, depending on, but that's sort of, and everyone's sort of okay with that 50-50? And certainly within the critical amenities, it's fairly flexible, and I agree, technically could include daycares theoretically, depending on what we're trying to achieve, but it's not specific. Is that where council's going? Any more, were there specific questions you needed answered?
No, to be honest, I've got a lot to work with here. I've got a sense that we're not offside in the general direction, so we will move this forward with incorporating many of the comments we've heard from council today. So I've got plenty of material to work with from this point forward. So.
Excellent.
I want everything.
All right. Then we'll move on. Is that all right?
Yes, thank you.
Moving on to Green Tech Center DP 44. There's technically a motion on council's table, and we wanted to make sure we brought this back to committee for a bit of a dialogue before council reconsiders the motion at the next general regular meeting.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council. And in sort of getting to the end of it, we're probably not going to need that amendment to the existing motion. But in terms of just a little bit of history first, is that the phase development agreement with Newport Beach, or the Squamish Oceanfront Development, it sort of fixes the regulatory controls such as zoning and the subdivision development control bylaw for a period of 20 years, so both the developer and we have certainty. So those, the PDA, the phase development agreement negotiations proceeded quite through most of 2015, and the floodproofing covenant is the one that sort of has created issues for us. That was one of 16 schedules. PDA is on a council agenda next week? Yes, for discussion. Yes. So we'll give you a more robust overview of the PDA next week. The floodproofing covenant deals only with the geodetic elevation of the ground floor of the building. So that's basically where does the building sit in relation to the water in a vertical, in a simple sense. It's not designed to deal particularly with setbacks. The floodproofing covenant assumes and addresses a sea level rise to the year 2100 and about a metre of sea level rise, give or take. The floodproofing covenant that we have was agreed to with the developer with the original Tetra Tech report, which had that 10 metre assumed setback to establish the geodetic elevation of the floor of the building. So, now at that time, staff were concerned about the need for space to construct what is additional floodproofing beyond the year 2100, and that's this assumed additional diking on top of what the developer is proposing to construct, which is this. So staff asked Tetra Tech to revise that report to allow for a 15 metre setback, so that's to increase this dimension to 15 metres for the additional expansion of a sea defence structure. Tetra Tech revised the report, provided it to their client, they provided it to us, but no changes were made to the floodproofing covenant. Now, that report is attached to the back of the floodproofing covenant. The covenant remained the same. Now, and then the first page of that revised report was then attached to the covenant, and then it was subsequently registered. So, now, that 15 metre setback for additional floodproofing comes from provincial guidelines, and they say it's to accommodate this sort of standard dike, a metre high, 4 metres on the top, and standard side slopes. Now, zoning bylaw that we have has a 20 metre setback from the high water mark, and that's this point, so this is the 20 metre setback here to the building. And the 15-metre setback, which sort of further complicates this, is measured from a different point. It's measured from this point. It's measured from the future natural boundary. So part of the issue here is we've got two different setbacks that are measured from different points. So they may or may not be consistent. That 15 may fit in and 20 may not, depending on how different the high water mark is from the future natural boundary. The floodproofing covenant contains an interesting proviso, so it's a covenant, not the technical report. The covenant says a coastal flood hazard assessment prepared by a QEP has been provided to the district, a copy of which is attached to hereto, but not to qualify or condition any of the provisions of the covenant. So what it essentially says is the floodproofing report, whether it's the first one or the second one, is nice information, but that's it. It doesn't change the floodproofing covenant. So the floodproofing covenant itself simply outlines the minimum geodetic elevation required for the building. So it's this thing again. It doesn't address the setbacks for addressing future sea level rise or this additional floodproofing. In fact, both reports contain the statement that the following items were not addressed, and there's a set of bullets, one of which is accommodation of future expansion of the sea defence structure. So, essentially then that 15-metre setback, or the 10, doesn't exist from a regulatory point of view. There was, if we believed when we asked Tetra Tech to prepare that report that we were dealing with that issue and having that addressed, but without an amendment to the floodproofing covenant, and there wasn't one, it's simply a nice piece of information that we have. It's not a regulatory setback that we can enforce. So what we do have is the 20-metre setback from the high water mark, excuse me. We have a requirement of 6 metres from the waterfront walkway to a building. The waterfront walkway has to be 3 metres wide. It's roughly parallel and contiguous to the ocean. So no matter what, we've also got a de facto minimum 9 metre setback from the building to this point. That's going to be essentially no less than 9 metres no matter what happens. So in summary, there is no requirement to provide that 15-metre setback for a future expansion of the sea defence. So this stuff here. Buildings have to be set back from the high water mark by 20 metres. It meets that. The buildings must be set back from the walkway by 6 metres. The application meets that. The walkway needs to be no less than 3 metres. It meets that. So we have that effective setback. While that horizontal dimension, which has turned out to be 12 metres, doesn't meet that provincial guideline to accommodate future expansion, those setbacks do allow for some expansion. It may be more tricky. It may have a higher capital and maintenance costs. It may be more to construct, but it can be done in that horizontal 12-metre dimension that we have. Now the phase development agreement is good for 20 years, so it'll expire in 2035. At that point, the restrictions on what council can or cannot do with the zoning bylaw expire, and setbacks can be established as necessary at that time. So whatever guidelines that the province may have at that time, council can, at their discretion, set the setbacks as they deem appropriate. And it's highly unlikely that we're going to be needing to produce the extra sea level protection in that time period. If we do, we're probably going to have far more important things to worry about than setbacks. There's no serious concern that the district's ability to construct that future expansion of the sea defence is significantly compromised. It's compromised, but not significantly, by the lack of the 15 metres. Whether it's 10 or 12, It does allow for future accommodation. It might not be a standard dike as shown, as it anticipated by the guidelines, but at the time, when we actually need to build that, we'll have the ability to set setbacks post 2035 as the district deems appropriate. So, one final note is the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan has been sort of translated, that material has been translated into the draft floodplain management bylaw, which council will see
Next 2 to 3 months.
in the next quarter. And it requires that the 15-metre setback to accommodate future expansion of seed events is included in any consideration. So this is an issue that's specific to the phase development agreement. Subsequent developers will have statutory protections and statutory setbacks that deal with this issue. So that is the very brief summary of.
Well, it's not very brief.
No, the more we dug, the deeper it got.
So the way it's proposed, I'm just trying to simplify it. The way it's proposed meets the PDA.
Yes.
Is saying a 12-meter setback from the building. Is saying Green Shores-ish treatment, correct?
Yes.
And the choice is between getting Green Shores and possibly a larger setback from the building. So if you just took off the Green Shores and moved out the whole thing to 15 meters, you could get 15 meters, but you'd get riprap, steeper slope protection, correct?
That's quite possible that if you want to push the buildings further back, then the Green Shores design is compromised, yes, that's true.
Okay, Councillor Pratt.
Thank you. Yeah. But Gary said, this is nice information, because we haven't run this by flood management or any of those guys. We're taking the 20-meter setback from a fictitious point, because we don't know if we're going to get that setback. That's the part that worries me. So I think that part should be ironed out before we go too far down this, because we don't know where that 20 meters is going to be, because it has to go through flood management and all the federal guys, and the federal guys might say, sorry, if you take it from the existing high water mark, we're 25 feet farther out into the channel with this design. But it's fictitious because it hasn't gone by anybody yet, so that's what Gary says.
I don't believe that's what Gary was referring to with regard to nice to have information. It was very specific to, we have a rule over here and we have a PDA here, and that was, he's being very specific to a particular point, not to everything he just said, correct?
Sorry, I'm not quite clearly understanding the question.
Council Parr was saying that basically everything you said was just nice to have information.
This is nice to have, the drawing is nice to have information.
I don't think that's what he
No,
was
this is
specifying.
the best information that can be created at this time. I mean, if this can't be built and this point changes, then and the setbacks come into question, then we may have to come back to council with a confirmation on a different
But that's the
design.
jeopardy of the developer. That's the developer's jeopardy.
Well, and that's my point. So, I mean, it does have to go through flood management, right?
Navigable waters.
Okay, navigable waters, even more harder to deal with. So it goes through navigable water, and they say, stick with your existing high water mark. Don't be pushing the high water mark 20 feet out and 25 feet out into the water. Then does that push the buildings and everything back 25 feet in? Yes.
Part of the difficulty here is that nothing on that site is going to look anything like it does right now. It can't, because of the fact that to meet the flood, the FCL, the dirt or the dike, we've moved past a dike, the dirt's close to 3 meters higher than. The interface between the earth and the water cannot remain the same. It's physically not possible.
I beg your pardon?
It can't look the same as it does right now, unless you want.
can't start there and go back that way? You
Well,
have to go out into the water?
If you start here with a Green Shores prototype,
Yeah.
there's not a lot left to develop.
we're talking 20, 25 feet difference. We're not talking 400
But
feet.
if you start the Green Shores
No.
at this point in time, come back through
No,
here,
start Green
25
Shores
feet
now.
along a 200-kilometer waterway is a significant amount of developable land, significant.
24 feet.
I would
Along
suspect
the
it's a
length.
good deal
Well,
more than
anyway,
25
I'll
feet.
just leave that to Fed guys.
Right.
I'll move on, I've got something else.
Yeah, so just to clarify, it's up to, if now the water says it isn't doable, it'll have to come back.
Yeah,
That's
that's
kind of out of our purview.
but I got it.
Mr. Hyde, I'll come back to you a second.
I have 2 points of clarification. This is not a nice to have, this is a design drawing. Written into the PDA is a 60-foot easement that we agreed to, and that's what's there, 60 feet. That's what we agreed to, that's that's a design drawing for what we actually hope to build. It is a bit of a trade-off between Green Shores and flood protection. This is not a dike, although the inspector of dikes would like to review it. It's not a dike, it's erosion protection. And that's a significant difference. We do have to get it past DFO and the Navigation Protection Act, but if council, if the District of Squamish supports this, staff support it, it will get passed. If they don't support it, well then it won't.
Okay, well, I'm a little bit, so the 60 meters starts at high water.
60
feet.
feet, 20 meters
Starts at high
is
water.
what is
Okay,
prescribed.
well, I'll wait for the federal guys to report on this. I won't belay it, but I do think the community always saw that side of SODC as environment. And I think we're moving away from that. We're pushing everything. Now, so on the diking, why can't we use the building so that you got the back slope of the dike there, you got meter or 2 meters there of the back slope for potential expanding of the dike when we need to bring it up? Why can't we use the building for that? Why can't the foundation of the building be part of
I
that?
think the developer would probably like to do that.
Yeah, I mean,
I know, but I'm just saying
because it's a, it's a fine balance to, 12 meters is what you've got. If we push that back to 6 meters, developer would be super happy. You're gonna have a much shallower angle. But
Well, I mean,
in
we're
the year
talking about-
2100 or 2200, when you come, and remember that the dotted line at the top is the year 2200 sea level rise, and that gets there 4 times a year. That's the maximum height at 2200. So what we're actually creating is a meter of splash protection. In the year 2200, it's going to be tough to do because you haven't got enough room. Now, you may be able in the year 2200 to expropriate the land with the public's interest. Maybe a lot of things you do in the year 2200. Maybe we'll float around in flying cars. I don't
Repurpose
know.
warehouse may not be there in your.
Yeah, repurpose. So I really feel that we tried to balance the public's interest here because this land is for public use for the next 180 years. Although I understand the sea level's rising, it's rising very slowly. It's not going to sneak up on us. We'll have time and technologies to fix it.
Minus the 3 meters.
3 meters is etched in stone. No, I did mention at the time that the more you raise the land, the steeper the bank.
Yeah, unless you move it close, or unless you move the buildings in.
Well, turn the whole thing to park.
Yeah. We're talking 1 part of the whole development.
Well, no, it's about 4 acres of land that you're suggesting we lose.
So this decision now is determining what goes on the whole site, all the way around?
No, the PDA determined what went on the site.
Yeah, so what staff is saying is there's no variance of the PDA.
Yeah.
The DP can be voted on as presented with the 12-meter setback, and it's not technically requiring a variance on the PDA, which is what procedurally we were worried about. Whether or not you approve the DPA, that's an individual decision of council.
Anyway.
Any other questions? So this will come back to us next week
Actually,
for consideration. I think it's on the agenda for next week.
I think the only thing that needs to be done is to make a decision on that motion to amend.
That would be done in the regular meeting.
Yeah, I don't think our corporate.
That's right, Mayor Heitzman. If the motion to amend is no longer relevant, the mover and seconder can just withdraw it. And then you can decide to reconsider or not at that time. And if there's nothing actually to reconsider, then withdraw that again.
Okay. That we do that at the regular meeting.
At the regular meeting, that's right.
Councillor Smith?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank staff because I think this was pretty complicated for us to understand in the decision, bringing it back and bringing us good information. I appreciate the developer also coming in and clarifying some of that because it was pretty confusing to be presented all of that at once, and I really appreciate staff's attention to it.
Okay. He's hoping the next one, testing the PDA will. Moving on
Thank
to
you.
Woodfibre LNG environmental assessment. Response.
Thank you, Mayor Heitzman. My name is Chris Wickham. I'm the Director of Engineering for the district. And we were here 6 weeks ago or so to provide our comments to the Woodfibre LNG working group around the application by Woodfibre for a change to their environmental assessment. They had requested a change from water cooling to air cooling, and they had also requested change to water intake to include the possibility of taking in water from Woodfibre Creek as well as Mill Creek. So we did give our feedback based on that session we had here. Woodfibre LNG has prepared responses, which you can see on the screen here, and which were part of your agenda. And so the purpose of this update is just to let council know where the process is, to look at the responses, and we do have an opportunity to go back to the working group or to the Environmental Assessment Office with comments, and I think we can CC Woodfibre LNG on any questions that we have. So I just wanted to run through our comments and the responses very quickly. We're starting with
Maybe you could also, hopefully you put your mind to it, are there comments or responses submitted by others that were of particular interest? That, like, if you have an opportunity to outline some of that, that'd be good.
To be honest, I haven't been through the others. I've been very short-sighted and district-centered. So if any of the councillors or anybody else in the room has comments that they'd like to bring up on those, I'm open to that as well. I don't think there's any reason I can't return comments on other people's. That's a good point. So there were three areas that we spoke about most in the discussion we had. The first was around bats and the little brown myotis, which is a species at risk. The response from Woodfibre was that the cooling fans would be shrouded and oriented in such a way that there would be minimal risk of physical trauma to a bat, and that the sound levels will remain within the range assessed, and they don't see additional effects to any at-risk bat populations.
Sorry. What's the difference between a shroud and a screen? Because I know one of the other respondents from the Environment Ministry asked about screening in regards to bats and birds, and they've used the word shroud. and I don't know what that means. I
That's
mean, I
a-
know what that means for a dead person, but I don't know what that means for a fact.
Biblical context.
The Shroud of Turin. That's an excellent point. I think a shroud can be interpreted to be just the horizontal, just a ring around the fans and not necessarily screening.
Because they're sucking you down. So if you flew over the
Blowing it up,
blowing up.
yeah.
Anyway, I think some of their language is a bit vague. Like, I really don't understand what that means.
Maybe it's good to get more clarity to what they mean by shroud, because it's a weird word to use in this context. So they're gonna have material preventing, I don't know what they're doing. So if we get some clarity, that's good.
Sure.
Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other comments on bats? Questions? Little brown bats. We also had asked for a 3D mock-up, both day and night, showing new cooling system, and asking for a complete view, including other elements, such as the hydro and Fortis rights away. We didn't receive that. Instead, we received discussion of the total height, and saying that the height won't go up anymore. I don't think it was the height that we were worried about. So,
So if we could re-ask for this
I
3D
think,
perspective.
yeah, I think that's
cumulative
worthwhile.
perspective. Basically respond, they didn't answer our question.
Exactly. Well, it's useful to know that it's no higher, but we're not trying to see over it. We're looking at it from across the bay, so it's not necessarily relevant.
Doug?
I'm sorry, did you say we had asked for the hydro right away from the transmission lines to the site and the pipeline to the site? But is that related to switching to water cooling?
It isn't. I think we had originally asked for sort of a full view in the original application. I never received it. And so when we asked for, show us what the change looks like, we also said, and by the way, show us what the change looks like and everything
In
else.
context to the whole project.
And we might be dancing in the gray area a little bit on whether that's related just to the delta, but I think we still would like to see what the whole project looks like.
I don't think we're asking a lot here, and I don't understand why they keep just not providing us with that picture. I don't understand why they won't. So I think it's fine to keep asking for it.
Yeah, and to your point, I'm sure they have it. Anybody building a project of that magnitude would have a 3D CAD model of it with whatever permutations or variations they intend to use. They'd have something.
Right.
I really don't understand why they just don't send a 3D picture. I don't understand. Okay.
We then had a series of questions about the sound modeling. A side point, the Environmental Assessment Office did find that they had missed 3 noise generators in their original model, so they redid the model, and that, there's a memo attached to your agenda regarding that. They just found negligible
Who missed
impact.
that?
Wood fiber LNG, or Hamera, perhaps, who did the modeling. So that was caught by the EAO, which was a pretty good catch. They redid the model with those noise sources and found negligible change. They're relatively minor pieces of equipment that were missed. So they have responded to our questions. I think of note is that Wood Fiber suggested that the proper place to talk about the noise levels and the ongoing what's permitted and not is actually in the LNG facility permit from the Oil and Gas Commission, and which has a limit of 50 dBA within 1.5 kilometers of the site. I think they're probably right. That is probably the right place, and there is ongoing enforcement of that facilities permit. Regardless, we do see, we asked about tugs, wind, noise spectrum, and they responded to each one of our detailed questions. I think given that the noise levels are relatively low, I don't know if council would like me to respond back on any of these or what your feelings are.
Pardon my ignorance, but how big a wind is 5 meters per second?
It is about 10 knots, 18 kilometers per hour.
What is it flowing on like a windy day in the summer?
Closer to 20 knots.
20 to 35, maybe not at Woodfibre, but certainly in Spit.
Yeah, that was my point. From my personal experience, it doesn't blow anywhere near as hard at Woodfibre as it does at the oceanfront. Windsurfing wind is actually, on a typical day, fairly shallow in the sense that it doesn't extend that much into the sound from the south end of the oceanfront. By the time you get to Watts Point, often it's calm on a very windy day in Squamish. Although you wonder how that ever happens. There are some days where it blows right through the sound, certainly. But in my experience, not the typical day. So I guess the question would be whether the sound would get very far from Woodfibre just with the wind. Other things might propel it, but the immediate impact of the wind at Woodfibre would probably be less than it would be at the oceanfront. I think that's one of the reasons historically it was selected as a site, was just because it's not subject to the same forces.
I think Councillor Race made an important point at our last session that once you get above about 10 knots of wind, the actual noise of the wind is so much whistling to the trees and the houses and your hat that it actually starts muffling the noise. Those are the 3 key points that we brought up, that there was most discussion around. There are a few other items around construction employment. They said it would be about the same. We had some considerable discussion, especially from the community, around the e-drive rate. Response from Woodfibre is that it's actually the same rate that other mines, pulp mills, and factories in BC are charged. And that's, I'm open to any other input that people would like me to respond with.
I don't see any hands at this point. I do want to make sure the public that's in the room has an opportunity to ask questions too. So just let me know if you're interested. Mr. Whitman, you said you didn't really have a chance to go through some of the other responses to see if there was any comments or questions or responses of particular interest. Certainly I thought some of the stuff with regards to the specific surface water issues around some of the creeks was kind of interesting, but I don't know enough to comment specifically. Yeah, come on up, and we'll just, hold on a sec, but come on up and you're welcome to, and I'm just trying to quickly browse through the questions here, but you didn't put your mind to that, is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
Yeah, come on up.
Should we up the first?
Yeah, oh, just at the table, just at the committee table, yeah.
Hi, my name is Mark. I have been living in Squamish a homeowner since 2003. And I've just swung by and saw you guys in the council meeting and figured it's about time to sort of join in and hear in, and thank you. I actually live right in front of Mike Lonsdale, whose mom used to be mayor of Squamish for many years. It's a bit of a potentially strange. I'm not sure if, please forgive me if this has already been gone over, but I'm just very curious as to catastrophic failure. So if you're dealing with LNG, if you're dealing with gas, And by the way, keep in mind that I've been out in Europe for the last 2 months, so I'm not current with the events of Squamish and what's happening these days. Catastrophic failure in the sense of if, so natural gas gets condensed to liquid, that takes a lot of gas to condense into liquid. So when the tons of liquid gets moved around, catastrophic failure, if everything gets airborne again for any given reason, what are the expected case scenarios of what worst case scenario could provide? That's kind of my question.
Yeah, and that's a huge question, and it's a good one. And I'm not sure if it was originally addressed in the original environmental assessment process. So what's happened, probably since you've been away, is wood fiber changed from a seawater, so they got a certificate with conditions, I guess about a year ago now. And what's happened now is they've gone and said, we're going to change this from seawater cooling to air water cooling system. So they had to resubmit an amendment to the certificate they got from the provincial and federal governments to show the change between seawater and air water. So the provincial environmental assessment engagement process and comment process was opened up again, but specific to the change from seawater to air cooling. So the actual addressing of the catastrophic stuff, I'm assuming,
Should have been dealt
was
with a
dealt
long
with in
time
the
ago,
whole,
over a year ago.
and I know that's dealt with the BC oil and gas regulations and emergency planning, and there's some other processes that may not have been addressed through the environmental assessment process, but are addressed through other regulatory processes that they haven't completed yet. Am I getting that even closer, right? Chris?
I think that's correct.
So I don't know if we can answer that.
I'm just
Yeah,
thinking
no, it's a
as
good
a
question.
father who's a biochemist, a stepfather who's a biochemist, these things, and I studied health sciences in college, so biochemistry, chemistry, biology, electrical physics, all those things is what I took in school. And it's just things that, for me, it's a direct thing that I felt I haven't gotten a clear answer to, which maybe has been provided.
I think the best way to get that answer is to go to WLNG office and ask them specifically to outline that for you and get it directly from them. And then if you want to do further research or contemplation, then at least you have a starting point based on what they're telling people or what they're.
But as long as you guys are comfortable with it,
I'm
I'm comfortable in you guys representing me as long as you hear the voice of someone.
Yeah, and I don't remember the specific details within the original environmental, like that was almost 2 years ago, so I
I'm
just.
sorry I'm coming so late
Yeah, no,
about
that's,
this.
I appreciate the comments for sure.
I wouldn't want to speak for other arms of government or have an official staff position necessarily on it, but I guess from an engineering standpoint, general principles, I think we're looking at two different risks. There's an environmental risk and public safety risk. Environmental risk, as you say, we put a lot of effort into making it into a liquid, and if there's a rupture, it then becomes a gas again.
How much gas and how does that gas affect nature and?
It's the gas is methane gas, essentially, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, and we don't want it getting back into the environment.
Which is combustible as well, right?
So the environmental impact would be mostly around greenhouse gas emission, and significant. And then, as you say, it's combustible, so that becomes the public safety. It is remote from the district and any other habitations, I was going to say habitat, human habitat. They will be working with our Emergency Operations Center to have joint procedures. But I guess the simple way to put it is the town of Squamish is out of the blast zone from the site itself.
But what happens when all the methane, chemically, what happens when all the methane potentially combusts? Does that create a vacuum? What happens to for example, the attic?
I think you need to specifically talk to WLNG about it. It's not technically on our agenda today.
Sorry.
It's not foremost in our mind in terms of, we don't have it in front of us.
I'm going way far back.
And there has been talk about blast zones within the navigational waters and impacts on that route, and That's completely separate from the process that we're looking at. It wasn't even addressed at all during the environmental assessment process. So that's a federal government consideration, so that's a conversation I think we need to take up with federal representatives, Mr. Garneau and others. But I would suggest going to the WLNG office and saying,
Where is it exactly?
where's their
Just
office?
back at the- back
Yeah.
in the-
They might be down on the,
That says in partnership.
I thought their office was near
Back in the
Platypus
office.
they might be
No,
down.
they
the-
moved it back downtown. They
Yeah.
opened their office back on Cleveland Avenue.
Yeah, okay, so right on Cleveland Avenue,
Where on Cleveland?
Couple block,
near the soap
2
shop.
blocks from here.
Okay.
Right by the
Right.
new
It's
social
just down
shop.
from, of course, the
Across from
cycles and up
RBC.
from
Okay.
the nail and the vintage place. Any other comments on what Mr. Wickham has presented or questions about any of the other? Thanks very much.
Thank you for inviting me to the table.
Yeah, anytime.
Take my seat back.
Or any other good comments that were outlined? See any hands? Need a motion? The council receive the WLNG responses to the district. I think we provided you with some comments to respond. And respond as per the conversation. Sound good? Moved by Council Kent, seconded by Mr. Spell. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And finally, we have Public Rail Safety Week. And there was a request that we get this on the agenda just because it's coming up. Even though it's committee of the whole, I'm hoping council will move that council raise news of the district of Squamish proclaim April 24th, April 30th as Public Rail Safety Week in the district of Squamish. Seconded by Councilor Kent. Call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. And then there's a motion to terminate the meeting moved by Councilor Pryor, seconded by Councilor Race. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries.